over to Robert. I'll turn this over to Robert McLaughlin, who is chairing the session.
Thank you. Sally and I are sitting on the front lawn in Sauk Center, sharing a computer today. Welcome to panel number one. We have three presentations on Babbitt to celebrate it during this 100th anniversary year. Two of the presentations are by superstars in Lewis studies, Sally Parry and George Killough, and the third is by me, but it's just me. Sally's already reminded everybody to mute yourselves. We'll save the questions until the end after all three papers have been presented, and then those have gone pretty smoothly so far. You can do through this chat feature, raise your hand. Sally, you're going first, aren't you?
I am.
I will let you read your title.
All right, thank you, everybody. It's I'm delighted that this virtual conference is turning out as well as it has. Today, I'm speaking on the man nobody knows, George Babbitt, and religion. This has been a fascination of mine for a while, and religion is not really been much of the focus of scholarship, so I thought I would give it a try through a particular lens. Usually when people talk about Lewis's writing on religion, they think primarily of Elmer Gantry, and if they're really into Lewis, perhaps the God Seeker. But references to religion show up in many of his novels where there's a tension between organized religion and religious belief. I was reminded of this in late April when Rusty Allred shared one of his favorite quotes from Main Street on the Lewis listserv. So Rusty, thank you for helping me come up with this paper. And the quote is one in which Will Kennicott isn't sure what to think about Carroll's religious beliefs. So let me quote from this. Will believed in the Christian religion and never thought about it. He believed in the church and seldom went near it. He was shocked by Carroll's lack of faith, and he wasn't quite sure what the nature of the faith that she lacked. Carroll herself was an uneasy and dodging agnostic. When she ventured to Sunday school and heard the teachers droning that the genealogy of the Sham Shirai was a valuable ethical problem for children to think about, when she experimented with a Wednesday prayer meeting and listened to storekeeping elders giving their unvarying weekly testimony in primitive erotic symbols and such gory Chaldean phrases as washed in the blood of the Lamb and a vengeful God, then Carroll was dismayed to find that the Christian religion in America in the 20th century as abnormal as Zoroastrianism without the splendor. But when she went to church suppers and felt the friendliness, saw the gaiety with which the sisters served cold ham and scalloped potatoes, and Mrs. Champ Parry cried to her on an afternoon call, "My dear, if you just knew how happy it makes you to come into abiding grace," then Carroll found the humanness behind the sanguinary and alien theology. For Carroll, thinking about rather than just repeating rote phrases from the Bible and church services makes her feel how alien and alienating Christianity can be. However, the fellowship and charity of the church community is something that Carroll would like to participate in, since she feels strongly that the progressive community spirit, whether spurred on by religion or not, is important in making the town of Gopher Prairie a much better and kinder place in which to live. George Babbitt also looks to the church for community, although it fails him when he suffers a midlife crisis. The church he and his family attend, the Chatham Road Presbyterian Church, is one that people belong to for social status rather than for spiritual guidance. It is described as, quote, one of the largest and richest, one of the most oaken and velvety in Zenith. Especially in the first half of the 20th century, the church you attended, like country club membership, indicated your worth in the community, especially the business community. And Dr. John Jennison Drew, the pastor, exemplifies what his congregation wants. Quote, he presided at meetings for the denunciation of unions or the elevation of domestic service and confided to the audiences that as a poor boy, he had carried newspapers. For the Saturday edition of the Evening Advocate, he wrote editorials on the manly man's religion and the dollars and cents value of Christianity. He often said that he was proud to be known as primarily a businessman, end quote. Sinclair Lewis himself was enthralled with religion as a teenager and considered himself a muscular Christian, aligning himself with the evangelical movement that was sweeping the nation at the beginning of the 20th century. Although he went to Oberlin College as academic preparation for Yale University, he thought seriously about becoming a missionary. When he started at Yale, he still had his religious calling but after a year or so of exposure to many ideologies, he lost his enthusiasm for organized religion, which becomes clear in many of his novels. Babbitt begins with a paean to the city of Zenith, and right from the first page, it's clear that business has become the religion of the community. For the towers of Zenith that aspired above the morning mist were neither citadels nor churches, but frankly and beautifully office buildings. Those who are faithful to business portray themselves as happy and fulfilled. George F. Babbitt appears to be one of the faithful, although his dreams of the fairy girl, which he has had for years, are an indication that he wants to be a gallant youth cavorting with a young woman rather than the predictable middle-aged businessman that he has become. As he puts on his suit, rather like donning ceremonial robes, he takes on the uniform as a solid citizen, along with the accoutrements of penknife, cigar cutter, fountain pen, watch, and a large yellowish elk's tooth. Although a melancholy has possessed him, seeing the 35-story Second National Tower causes him to lift his chin in reverence. Because for him, quote, the tower acts as a temple spire of the religion of business, a faith passionate, exalted, surpassing common men. It's as though the office building has replaced the cross as an object of veneration. Lewis's narrator conflates religious and business rhetoric from the very beginning to demonstrate how closely the two are linked. Although it's easy to mock Babbitt, the alliance of business and religion was part of the zeitgeist of the 1920s. As Emily Watts notes, Lewis realized even before the proletarian writers themselves that organized religion, a religion that is organized around business principles, would oppose socialism or radical unionism of any kind. Andrew J. Ball goes further, arguing that Taylorism, the scientific management of factories, became aligned with religion so that churches adopted the priorities and procedures of the modern factory, while at the same time industry, commerce, and consumption began to assume the trappings of religion. One of the best examples of the merging of business and religion during the 1920s is Bruce Barton's The Man Nobody Knows, A Discovery of the Real Jesus, published in 1925. Jesus. Barton, an advertising man, felt strongly about both Christianity and business and proposed that Jesus, rather than being a meek and mild savior, was the epitome of the business executive, an effective speaker, an excellent leader of men, with one exception, and a possessor of great patience in developing a long-term plan. His epigraph comes from the 12-year-old Jesus's response to his mother, who has been searching for him. I quote, "Wist ye not I must be about my father's business?" So Babbitt's spiritual advisor seems to be his neighbor, Howard Littlefield, PhD, as strict a Presbyterian and as firm a Republican as George F. Babbitt. He confirmed the businessmen in the faith. Babbitt contributes to his church, the Red Cross, and the YMCA, believing all these donations are a cost of doing business. His business temple is the Zenith Athletic Club, which is described as a combination of cathedral and rathskeller. With a row of porcelain sinks in the men's room, or quote, a line of men bent over the bowls inset along a prodigious slab of marble, as in religious prostration. But it is at this temple of business that Babbitt's frustration with his life comes to a head as he lunches with his only true friend, Paul Riesling. A midlife crisis seems to be coming on as he tells Paul, quote, I've pretty much done all the things I ought to, supported my family, got a good house and a 6-cylinder car, and built up a nice little business, and yet so I'm not entirely satisfied. Paul admits similar feelings, although his life is rougher because of the poor relationship he has with his wife, and a job he finds much less fulfilling than Babbitt's. They agree that a vacation away from family and routine may provide spiritual renewal. Although the 3 weeks in Maine seems to be a tonic for Babbitt in curing his nervous irritation, it doesn't last long. He plunges back into business, speaking at the State Association of Real Estate Boards and campaigning for Lucas Prout for mayor.
Well, this is.
He appears to have broken out of his funk and wondered how he could have questioned the joys of being a solid citizen. One of the highlights of the life of the re-energized Babbitt is being asked to serve on the Sunday School Advisory Committee of the Chatham Road Presbyterian Church, with the rich and conservative banker William Washington Eathorne and the renowned popular poet Chum Frink. The committee is not charged with anything religious, rather to garner publicity for the Sunday school and make it grow from 4th largest in the city to 1st. Salesmanship is what Babbitt is good at, since his theology is rather vague. And here's his theology. There was a supreme being who had tried to make us perfect, but presumably had failed. That if one was a good man, he would go to a place called heaven. Babbitt unconsciously pictured it as rather like an excellent hotel with a private garden. But if one was a bad man, that is, if he murdered or committed a burglary or used cocaine or had mistresses or sold non-existent real estate, he would be punished. Babbitt thinks of his religious duties as something that solid citizens do. Quote, the kernel of his practical religion was that it was respectable and beneficial to one's business to be seen going to services, that the church kept the worst elements from being still worse, and that the pastor's sermons, however dull they might seem at the time of taking, yet had a voodooistic power which did a fellow good, kept him in touch with higher things. Babbitt admires the prizefighter turned evangelist Mike Monday, who is the world's greatest salesman of salvation. For Monday, as for Babbitt, the selling is more important than the message. And the way to measure how successful a church is not in service to the community or the congregation's engagement with religious beliefs, but in how much money is taken in collections and donations, how many people attend services in Sunday school, and how many new members enroll. All are easily measurable and highly promotable metrics. As Babbitt tells Ethorn, it comes down to real hustling, getting out and drumming up customers or members. Babbitt's solution is to hire a press agent and compete and create competitions among the Sunday school kids to bring in new members by offering them great prizes. Quote, not a lot of follow-alls and doodads like poetry books and illustrated testaments. The confluence of masculinity, religion, and business stressed by Bruce Barton was certainly inspired by the muscular Christianity movement. Barton portrayed Jesus as a manly man, which Babbitt would have appreciated and which the capitalistic 1920s celebrated. After Babbitt had studied the Sunday school journals, he grew to appreciate a real virile hustling religion, sort of a Christianity incorporated. Barton contended that Jesus would be a national advertiser today and described the sort of headlines that Jesus would receive for his parables, such as, what happened to the one lost sheep? Babbitt thinks, which I think is hilarious. Babbitt thinks in a similar vein and offers Ethorn an example of a trick headline to get readers' attention. Quote, Jake fools the old man, makes getaway with girl and bankroll. Although Babbitt and his committee make their church's Sunday school the second biggest in Zenith, his discontent reemerges. After eating a questionable clam, Babbitt gets sick and goes into a funk where he questions not only mechanical business, but mechanical religion, a dry, hard church shut off from the real life of the streets. This disillusionment with two of the certainties in his life is indicative of Babbitt's despair. When Paul Riesling is imprisoned for the attempted murder of his wife Zilla and no longer a part of Babbitt's life, Babbitt's hopelessness accelerates because for him, a world which, without Paul, was meaningless. Several months later, when his wife Myra and their youngest child visit family back east, Babbitt feels cast into a world without structure or love, since his other two children are grown and don't need him. There's no Paul, no fairy girl, and no God. He even visits Zilla to see if she'll ask for a pardon for Paul. Zilla has aged and become permanently disfigured from the shooting. She has found refuge in religion, but a religion of revenge and punishment. So she wants Paul to stay in prison as an example to evildoers, even hoping he dies there. Babbitt responds disgustingly with one of his few direct statements about his religious belief. The essence of religion is to be charitable. In the search for some sort of meaning in life, Babbitt flirts with several neighbors at a party and a manicurist before having an affair with Tanis Judith, a widow in her early 40s. But his life still feels hollow and his crisis becomes an existential one that cannot be fixed by attending parties and having an affair. When Babbitt's friends try to force him to join the Good Citizens League to bring him back into the conservative community, he rebels against them as well. He feels persecuted by his friends, his business associates, his wife, even his church. It is only when his wife suffers from an attack of acute appendicitis that, quote, the indignations that had been dominating in the spiritual dramas through which he had struggled became pallid and absurd before the ancient and overwhelming realities of sickness and menacing death. The gravity of his wife's illness acts like an antidote to his spiritual sickness. As he glimpses the operation, he seems to be praying, quote, and this is kind of his prayer. He swore faith to his wife, to Zenith, to business efficiency, to the Boosters Club, to every faith of the clan of good fellows. And it's the good fellows who provide the community that helps not only Myra, but George Babbitt to heal. Although it's easy to mock them and to be terrified of the Good Citizens League, they're the ones who visit Myra in the hospital, bring her wine jelly, flavored with real wine, novels she likes, a pink bed jacket, and a nightgown. Not Reverend Dr. Drew. Babbitt returns to the church as he does to the Boosters Club, but Dr. Drew provides neither spiritual guidance nor a sense of community. He is a hypocrite, almost leering when he asks Babbitt whether his sins included other women. And he can only squeeze in 5 minutes for prayer, in a vague, cliched prayer at that, since he has to meet with the Don't Make Prohibition a Joke Association, followed by the Anti-Birth Control Union. Drew even checks his watch so as not to pray too long. Babbitt maintained his church membership after this, but that's because that's what men of his group do. But he avoids shaking hands with Drew at the close of services and finds friendship and consolation in the athletic club, the Boosters, the Elks. The church has failed its redemptive function, and what spiritual solace Babbitt is able to find is in the good fellows that he has tried to repel from. Although George Babbitt's not a deep thinker, his yearning for something or someone to provide his life with meaning is profound. Ironically, it's the boisterous and often overbearing business groups that he belongs to and tries to escape from that provide him with the faith community he needs going forward, not the church. He even realizes the irony that, quote, he had been trapped into the very net from which he had been with such fury escaped, and supremest just of all had been made to rejoice in the trapping. Thank you.
Thank you, Sally. That was really interesting. I think I'm noticing a lot of overlap with some of what I'm going to be talking about. I hope productively. I'm Robert McLaughlin, the recently retired from Illinois State University. Called Inside Looking Out, Outside Looking In, Group Affiliation and Disaffiliation in Babbitt. About a third of the way into Babbitt, Sinclair Lewis's hero, George F. Babbitt, and his best friend, Paul Riesling, board a train east for their boys-only week in the Maine woods. It doesn't take them long to head to the smoking car, where they join a group of fellow travelers, apparently all salesmen. Once the ice is broken, Babbitt easily slides into their conversation as they hash over good and bad hotels, business conditions around the country, the high price of clothes, and the wonder of automobiles, eventually moving on to racy stories. The narrator tells us, quote, they admired and loved one another. Having established themselves as a small, like-minded group, they go to some lengths to maintain that community. When one man complains about the cost of collars, another man, a collar salesman, leaps to defend his product. The others quickly placate him. They voted that if their old friend, the fat man, sold collars, then the price of collars was exactly what it should be. Equally important, they easily agree on who must be excluded from the group. First, the young salesman who doesn't defer to the older man's experience, and then Paul, when he, quote, committed an offense against the holy law of the clan of good fellows, he became highbrow. More broadly, the appearance of a black porter inspires the exclusionary verdict that African Americans and immigrants need to stay in their place. In next to no time, these strangers have formed a club of sorts, complete with unspoken rules for conversation, for attitudes toward their shared interests, for who is allowed to be a member and for who isn't. Group membership and the rules for how groups work are central to how Lewis's novels function narratively. Lewis generally eschews strong, straightforward narrative in his novels. A leading to B, B leading to C, and so on, until some kind of interpretively revelatory climax is reached. Rather, his novels tend to be structured episodically, with incidents and observations set into resonance with one another, meaning accruing over the course of the book. Babbitt creates narrative tension and release through group membership. It is through the groups that Babbitt joins, quits, refuses to join, or isn't allowed to join that we come to understand his character and the novel's critique of the America of its time. The narrator also skillfully creates his effects by the way he maneuvers the reader in relation to the novel's communities. At the beginning of chapter 16, the narrator tells us, quote, Babbitt was what he called a joiner. Now, the narrator must be afraid we haven't been paying attention. Throughout the novel to this point, we have been inundated with the groups, formal, informal, and ad hoc that Babbitt belongs to. An exhausting, if not exhaustive, list includes the Floral Heights neighborhood, the Republican Party, the Elks, the Country Club, the Boosters Club, the Reeves Building where Babbitt's real estate office is housed, the Zenith Athletic Club and his own informal subgroup in the club, the Roughnecks, the State Real Estate Board, the Zenith Real Estate Board, the Chatham Road Presbyterian Church, a host of lodges, and the previously mentioned Smoking Car Club. If we were to imagine a Venn diagram, which each of these groups represented by a circle, we would see that the circles overlap enormously, probably 75 to 90%, 95%, indicating a high degree of shared membership and shared ideologies. That is, each of these groups reproduces the same worldview to the same people. It is this ideological mechanism that to a great extent creates Babbitt's identity. Their values are his values. Production, sales, and growth as ideals, the superiority of each community to every other community, conformity, quid pro quo in business dealings, ethical lapses justified by the profit earned, personal possessions signaling personal worth, financial success indicating social status. These values also act as gatekeepers, excluding from the group those who would criticize its ideologies, especially socialists and other cranks, those who are from the working class, those who have dark skin, those who are immigrants, those who don't associate money with happiness and success. The narrative, however, makes sure that we understand that there are groups Babbitt doesn't join because they don't want him. We see Babbitt's desire to break through the gates and be accepted in Zenith's upper classes. Although he rails that he wouldn't join the hoity-toity union club even if they asked him, the fact is they don't ask him, especially as his fame as an orator and his services to the powers that be grow nettles him. He assiduously courts his former school chum and now Zenith mover and shaker Charles McKelvey, trying to move into the next higher social circle, but McKelvey reportedly and not too subtly brushes him off. He feels snubbed when he's not invited to any of the affairs celebrating the visit to Zenith of Sir Gerald Doak, and then becomes triumphant when he spends a night carousing with Sir Gerald in Chicago. In short, while Babbitt may loudly bray his loyalty to his many groups, he is at least occasionally dissatisfied by his exclusion from others he would like to join. However, the novel makes clear from its earliest pages that Babbitt's dissatisfactions run deeper than a desire for more prestigious social standing. At the very beginning of chapter 1, as Babbitt nears waking and before we are introduced to him or any of his defining groups, we are told about his recurring dream of the fairy child. Quote, "For years, the fairy child had come to him. Where others saw but Georgie Babbitt, she discerned gallant youth. She waited for him in the darkness beyond mysterious groves. When at last he could slip away from the crowded house, he darted to her. His wife, his clamoring friends sought to follow, but he escaped. The girl fleet beside him, and they crouched together on the shadowy hillside. She was so slim, so white, so eager. She cried that he was gay and valiant, that she would wait for him, that they would sail." The dream is then interrupted by the milk truck. Babbitt's yearning for the fairy child is less a sexual longing and more a desire to return to innocence, a time before his identity was defined by booster clubs and house sales, profits made and backs slapped. With the fairy child, it's still possible for Babbitt to be genuinely heroic, not the phony heroism represented by Rotary Club speeches and increasing Sunday school attendance and taking under the table payments for smoothing the way for streetcar track extensions. The dream shows that not far beneath the surface, Babbitt feels the need to escape from the maze-like overlapping circles of his Venn diagram. He sees the way they have trapped him and made him something different from what he truly is and what he truly could be. This dissatisfaction gnaws at him throughout the day, and the novel in its early stages has established a narrative tension between the Babbitt of the groups, the bragging, money-minded Babbitt, and the Babbitt of the fairy child, innocent, heroic, loved. Babbitt is able to negotiate this tension and maintain an equilibrium between these two aspects of his personality through his relationship with Paul Riesling. Paul is an old school chum and Babbitt's best friend, someone he admires and whose admiration in return he desires. But Paul is a tormented soul. An artist by nature, he had to give up his ambitions to be a violinist and become a roofing salesman so as to support his wife Zilla. He is haunted by this bad bargain. Unlike Babbitt, he cannot even pretend to believe in the ideology of sales and the religion of pep. When he joins Babbitt for lunch at the athletic club, Babbitt throws over the roughnecks so he and Paul can have a private table. And he makes a confession he'd never whisper to anyone but Paul. Quote, "I've pretty much done all the things I ought to, supported my family and got a good little house and a 6-cylinder car and built up a nice little business. And yet, even so, I don't know that I'm especially satisfied." Paul responds with a longer and more deeply felt litany of disappointments that feed his dissatisfactions. Thus, Babbitt is able to sustain his status quo. Talking to Paul, who understands immediately about the unhappiness gnawing at him, allows Babbitt to let off steam and keep the pressure he feels from becoming overwhelming. And seeing Paul's unhappiness allows Babbitt to play the role of older brother to Paul, keeping him on the rails and making his life bearable. When Paul was sent to prison for attempting to kill Zilla, Babbitt loses the stabilizing influence that has allowed him to balance the demands on his identity made by his various groups and his inner dissatisfactions and desires to escape. Previously, he had been having a banner year full of professional and personal triumphs. But after he loses Paul, he realizes, quote, he faced a world which, without Paul, was meaningless. As the weeks go on, the dissatisfaction with his life becomes overwhelming. Quote, it was coming to him that perhaps all life as he knew it and vigorously practiced it was futile. That heaven, as portrayed by the Reverend John Denison Drew, was neither probable nor very interesting. That he hadn't much pleasure out of making money. That it was of doubtful worth to rear children, merely that they might rear children who would rear children. What was it all about? What did he want? Babbitt subsequently takes a trip by himself to the Maine woods, hoping to recover what he'd found there with Paul, and also tentatively planning to escape and leave Zenith behind. He discovers, however, that he just can't do it. Quote, he could never run away from Zenith and family and office because in his own brain, he bore the office and the family and every street and disquiet and illusion of Zenith. His group memberships have done too good a job. Zenith, its values and its obligations are so tightly interwoven with his identity that he can't separate himself from them. At this low point, he has a chance encounter that will cause great upheavals in his life. On the train from New York, he sees Seneca Doane, a friend from school days, but now an antagonist in Zenith's political and economic spheres. Doane is, from the point of view of the Boosters Club, a crank, a socialist, and a radical lawyer. Every businessman in Zenith despises him because of his support for unions. But much to Babbitt's surprise, when they meet on the train, Doane doesn't resent him or argue with him. Rather, he relates that he admired Babbitt in college. Doane says, quote, I remember, in college you were an unusually liberal, sensitive chap. I can still recall your saying to me that you were going to be a lawyer and take the cases of the poor for nothing and fight the rich. I'm sure you inspired us all. Babbitt is surprised by this assessment of his younger self, but quickly accepts it and begins touting himself as always having been, quote, broad-minded and liberal. Babbitt here takes up Doane as a substitute for Paul, someone who admires him, someone who appreciates the things others don't see in him, and someone he can help. Doane asks him to make his fellow businessmen more tolerant of the maverick preacher, Beecher Ingram. This decision propels the action of the last section of the novel. Where Paul's presence had helped Babbitt maintain an equilibrium between pep sales and conforming Babbitt and the inner Babbitt who longs to escape, Doane's admiration is taken up by Babbitt in such a way as to throw his various group affiliations into disarray and to threaten his identity. At the same time, Zenith is hit by a general strike, which, with each passing day, becomes more antagonistic and violent. Babbitt's friends in the business community, in the boosters clubs, in the lodges, and in the prosperous suburbs, making united, making a united belligerent front against the strikers. And the narrator dryly notes, quote, Babbitt chose this time to be publicly liberal. At lunch with the Roughnecks and at the athletic club, he defends Seneca Doane and argues that they should all try to see the strikers' point of view. He mocks the shoe store proprietor who is leading the military response to the strike. He dismisses the Reverend Dr. Drew's pro-business sermon as bunk. He responds to a congressman's anti-immigration speech by defending immigrants. In short, he breaks his various groups' numerous rules for conversation, for conformity, for belief, and for good fellowship. In so doing, he begins a process of group disaffiliation, which offers the possibility and the threat of independence. Just as Babbitt mistakes Doane for a substitute for Paul, he mistakes the alluring widow, Tanis Judique, for his fairy child. Like the fairy child, Tanis seems to offer freedom and escape from his increasingly unsatisfactory marriage. Like the fairy child, she admires him, or at least claims to admire him, praising his youth, his intelligence, his savoir-faire. However, if she can be seen as the fairy child, she is a corrupt and perverted fairy child, bringing Babbitt not into freedom and independence as he thinks, but luring him into a new group that threatens his destruction. This new group is the Bunch, Zenith's contribution to the world of decadent bohemianism, whose members are dedicated to drink, jazz, dancing, roadhouses, mindless pleasures, but mostly drink. He quickly affiliates to the Bunch, participating in their routines and learning to obey their rules. The narrator sums up, once he was converted to dissipation, Babbitt discovered agreeable opportunities for it everywhere. It doesn't take Babbitt long to realize that Tanis and the Bunch offer him not escape, but a new set of obligations, which become increasingly difficult to accommodate to the family and business aspects of his life. After a long and difficult conversation, he breaks with Tanis, and by extension the Bunch, by sighing on his way home, quote, I'm free. However, his disaffiliation from the Bunch doesn't mean that he's returning to his former groups and life. After a fight with his wife, Myra, he resolves, quote, and I'm going to keep free of her and Tanis and the fellows at the club and everybody. I'm going to run my own life. He takes his chance to declare his independence from the fellows at the club when he is aggressively invited to join a new organization, the Good Citizens League, an anti-labor, pro-business, conformity-enforcing group that is not above using violence to achieve its ends. Babbitt thus disaffiliates from the various groups that have defined his identity, with mixed results. On the one hand, he takes his stand for independence and running his own life, but on the other hand, he suddenly finds himself an outsider, a small spot outside all the circles on the Zenith Venn diagram. He finds that more uncomfortable than being on the outside looking in at his many former groups is the feeling that he is the object of study of all those on the inside. He is increasingly aware of his former friends' gaze as they snub him on the street and imagines he can hear them talking about him. This reversal connects significantly to the novel's narrative structure. Throughout much of the novel, the narrator has invited us, the readers, to sit with him outside the world of the novel while he observes Babbitt, describes Babbitt, judges Babbitt. We are expected to join the narrator in criticizing and laughing at Babbitt. But after Paul's imprisonment, the narrator gradually introduces sympathy for Babbitt and encourages us to share it. By the time Babbitt stands outside all his groups, we stand with him, fearing for him and his experiment in independence and mourning the mess he's made of his life. When, after Myra's emergency operation, after the outpouring of support from his erstwhile friends, after he realizes Seneca Doane is not among those showing support, after he recants his heresy and swore faith to his wife, to Zenith, to business efficiency, to the Blues Club, to every faith of the clan of good fellows, And after Babbitt reaffiliates with his various groups, joshing and backslapping, being joshed and backslapped in return, readers are encouraged to feel relieved at his return to these groups that have made him what he is, where he can thrive and be reasonably happy. Whatever lingering criticisms we may have of Babbitt are mitigated by the self-awareness he shows in the novel's final pages, where he vows to support his son Ted in making his own life choices, and presumably in making his own choices about the groups with which to affiliate. Lewis's skill as a novelist is often underestimated. While his novels do have their loose, baggy elements, they are also carefully structured. In Babbitt, much of the narrative tension is generated through the presentation of group membership and the establishment of insiders and outsiders. This structural strategy is extended by the narrator to his manipulation of the reader's judgment, moving us from critical outsider to Babbitt's friend. Thank you. Well, Sally's clapping for me. Isn't that nice? So our third paper is George Killough, recently retired from the College of St. Scholastica in Duluth. I'm looking forward to this, especially at the last conference. George gave a paper on the one about the philanthropist.
Oh, like Gideon.
Gideon Planish.
Yeah, Planish, yeah.
It changed my whole way of looking at that novel. So, George, won't you please take it away?
Okay, here I am. Can you see me?
Yes.
Okay, let me share the screen here with my PowerPoint. Okay. Among the problems facing Sinclair Lewis's satirical character, George F. Babbitt, is the inadequacy of nearly all the modes of discourse available to him. He lives in a world in which meaningful human connections, if they occur at all, are more likely to occur in spite of language than because of it. Language, in most of its manifestations, working more to prevent human fulfillment than to foster it. The novel reinforces this point by showcasing a large number of kinds of discourse, many of them quoted at length, ranging from advertising copy to sermons. 22 of the discourse examples appear as quotations set apart from the rest of the text, usually in a smaller font, sometimes with indentation, giving them special prominence. As you see in the slides, the kinds illustrated include a business letter. Here's the business letter, 6 advertisements, 1, 2, there's a third, the 4th, and the 5th, and here's a 6 advertisements, 2 society page excerpts. Here's one, and here's another, 3 pep songs. Here are 2 of them, and here's the third. The scratch outline of a speech shown in Babbitt's handwriting, which we've seen before today. An alumni reunion reminder. This is the tickler number 3 here. An excerpt of a feature story and a printed place card. One example, an ad for a self-study course in public speaking, complete with boxed-in sidebars, goes on for over 500 words. The range of genre here and the length of verbiage help to establish the idea of the limited capacity for language in Babbitt's world. Each kind of discourse may capture a particular shallow meaning appropriate to itself. For example, the society page article that conveys the luxury of the appointments in the Charles McKelvey house. But since all the kinds are wedded to shallow meanings, the door to anything profound seems shut. In addition to quoted matter set apart from the text are many other examples of discourse, some of them as long or longer. 2 of Chum Frink's cornball poems are laid out as prose from margin to margin, with italics giving them prominence. The first of these, which defends prohibition, is relatively short. But the second, which defends standardization as a way to make every place in America seem like home, comprises nearly 500 words as a quote in the middle of Babbitt's speech to the Zenith Real Estate Board. This booster speech itself, presented in quotation marks as if being reported verbatim in the newspaper, occupies several pages and serves as yet another example of the shallow discourse framing Babbitt's world. Further examples of quotes woven into the text include an extended paragraph from Mike Monday's truculent sermon threatening violence to his critics, excerpts from 2 sermons by Dr. John Jennison Drew. Here's one of them. Here's another. Excerpts from Sunday school journals, parts of Mrs. Opal Emerson Mudge's New Thought Spiel. There you go. And the prayer that Dr. Drew offers for a repentant Babbitt as the 2 of them kneel near the end of the novel. Although all of these examples claim to carry religious significance, not one does so in a credible way. Beyond the reported public speeches and the examples of writing, the novel showcases conversations that are designed not as much to advance the plot or add further insight to character, as novels generally do, but instead to reveal the soullessness of the interchange. When the Babbitts host a dinner party, the men in attendance, quote, proclaim their views from the booming profundity of a prosperous male repeating a thoroughly hackneyed statement, unquote. Examples of their hackneyed utterances follow, most of which could have come from any one of the men, their assertions having little ability to differentiate speakers. Later in the novel, when Babbitt travels on a train and finds companionship in the smoking car, the narrator does not even bother to identify each speaker, but shows over several pages their cliched conversation in which, quote, all had the same ideas and expressed them always with the same ponderous and brassy assurance. The men at the dinner party and the men in the train speak a language that sticks in a groove without hope, apparently, of escape. Also stuck in a groove is the language of Tanis Judique and her demi-monde friends, the bunch, who gossip about each other while congratulating themselves on their social daring. Tanis herself, when explaining her troubles to Babbitt, illustrates the bunch's kind of talk. I did get so angry with Carrie. She told Minnie that I told her that Minnie was an awful tightwad, and Minnie told me Carrie had told her, and of course I told her I hadn't said anything of the kind, and then Carrie found Minnie had told me, and she was simply furious because Minnie had told me, and of course I was just boiling because Carrie had told her I told her, and so on. Lewis strengthens the idea that conversations are stuck in a groove by having characters repeat the same things to each other. When Babbitt leaves his house the first morning, he exchanges pleasantries with neighbor Howard Littlefield. Babbitt suggests that the nation needs a, quote, real business administration, unquote, to which Littlefield replies that, quote, first and foremost, unquote, the nation needs a, quote, business administration, unquote, leaving Babbitt to say further that the need is for a, quote, good, sound, economical business administration, unquote. A couple pages later, when Babbitt stops to have his car filled with gas, he informs the attendant that the national need is for a, quote, good, sound business administration, unquote. Similarly, repetitious conversations occur elsewhere, for example, among the men in the smoking car. A reason why conversations stick in a groove is that the modes of influential discourse explore only a limited number of topics, leaving their devotees without an understanding of anything else. 3 times in the novel, Babbitt himself finds himself with no opinion because the subject that has just come up has never been aired in the sources he relies on. In regard to the question of why students have to study Shakespeare, he feels that, quote, he wasn't really an authority. Neither the Advocate Times, the Evening Advocate, nor the Bulletin of the Zenith Chamber of Commerce had ever had an editorial on the matter, and until one of them had spoken, he found it hard to form an original opinion, unquote. He feels the same uncertainty when first faced with the idea of home study courses, and when faced with a newspaper story about a preacher mayor being inaugurated in overalls. However, when the discourse modes that influence him have offered a view, he knows exactly what to think. He is proud to have a sleeping porch because national advertisers portray it as a sign of success. The narrator tells us at this point that just as national advertisers, quote, fix what he believed to be his individuality, unquote, so also do the Elks, the Boosters, the Chamber of Commerce, and the Republican Party determine his opinions about international affairs, as does the Presbyterian Church determine, quote, his every religious belief, unquote. A kind of discourse that Lewis cannot exactly quote is film. However, the novel shows that this medium too has a limiting effect on the meanings communicated in Babbitt's world. He is said to like three stereotypical kinds of movies: the ones with bathing girls, the ones with cowboys shooting revolvers, and the ones with, quote, funny fat men who ate spaghetti. The suggestion is that movies follow well-worn pathways and thus comprise yet another cliched mode of discourse. Young Eunice Littlefield, next door, consumes motion picture magazines, which Lewis describes as conduits of the cliches of glamour. That film in the novel influences thought is shown in one of Babbitt's fantasies about escaping to the Maine woods. He imagines himself abandoning his family and plunging through the forest, quote, like a trapper in a northern Canada movie, unquote, while knowing in his heart that he will not do this. The one kind of discourse that might possibly carry meaning is imaginative literature, but Babbitt and his associates have no understanding of literary expression. For example, nobody in Babbitt's family knows what the value of reading Shakespeare might be. When the Babbitt's dinner party leads to a seance focused on communing with Dante, the communicants suggest that this old timer might not have been bad for his era, but probably could not keep up with modern poets like Chum Frink, who can meet the fast-paced demands of the present. Nobody has any sense of what Dante might have written. The expressive power of literature is beyond the ken of people in this novel. Further evidence of the problematic nature of language in Babbitt's world can be found in the contrast near the beginning of the novel between the dominant modes of discourse on the one hand and a phone conversation with beloved friend Paul Riesling on the other. Babbitt wants to get together for lunch. As with other modes of discourse, this phone call features cliches and repetition, but the two speakers care deeply for each other. Very few words are used, and the expressions by themselves have little meaning. The meaning here is being communicated more in spite of language than because of it. And here it is. Hello, Paul. Yeah. It's George speaking. Yeah. How's old socks? Fair to middling. How are you? Fine, Paulibus. Well, what do you know? Oh, nothing much. Where you been keeping yourself? Oh, just sticking around. What's up, Georgie? How about a little lunch this noon? Be all right with me, I guess. Club? Yeah. Meet you there 12:30. All right, 12:30. So long, Georgie. This interchange makes a startling contrast with the florid gushes of words seen before and soon to be seen after on the society page, in advertising copy, and the sample of oratory about the noble role of the realtor, and in bullying conversations with employees and clients. The point to see about all the modes of discourse featured in the novel is that they rarely carry meaning of human value. True, a few conversations occur when Babbitt speaks honestly with people he cares about, for example, with his friend Paul, with his wife Myra when she is stricken with appendicitis, and with his son Ted on the last page. But most of the speaking and writing make no allowance for such communication. Each genre of discourse has its own conventions based on a limited set of rules, a limited set of values. The society page touting the upper class lifestyle, advertisements bathing readers in the glory of consumer choice, the booster speech endorsing the economic and political status quo, group conversations, whether among businessmen or quasi-bohemian partiers, mainly promoting group cohesion, and religious statements, whether sermons, Sunday school journals, or New Thought Talk, also mainly promoting group affiliation and growth. Since groups tend to have an ideology of some sort, especially religious groups or booster cliques that create such outrages as the Good Citizens League, the fact that group talk conventionally promotes cohesion sets stifling limits on what can be said. With the customary idiom of each genre embodying implicit values and generally excluding others, expression tends to follow all too familiar pathways, heading often toward cliche. In fact, each genre itself can become a kind of cliche, ripe for parody by an able mimic such as Sinclair Lewis. His display of so many genres of such length helps to establish the way that familiar pathways of expression comprise one more means of standardization for entrapping people. Not only are conversations stuck in a groove, but elaborate statements such as speeches and sermons convey little more than annoying tropes of intolerance that we have heard before and that help to keep Babbitt and all his associates from growing as human beings. To be sure, languages in general depend on familiar ways of saying things, even on cliche. But in Babbitt's world, familiar modes of discourse have become too powerful. The chance that he could ever find a fulfilling way to think or fantasize is nearly nil. Hence, the novel ends up being almost as much an expose of American modes of discourse and their limiting and standardizing tendencies as it is of American character and life. By showcasing so many kinds of talk and writing, Lewis takes a big step in developing the theme of the suspicion of language that will show up again in Elmer Gantry, Gideon Planish, and The God Seeker, as I have shown elsewhere. The emphasis on modes of communication also enriches the satire in Babbitt and deepens the sense of danger readers experience. For the world throughout the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st has featured an ample supply of such uses of words. We are surrounded by the genre of discourse displayed at length in this novel. Thank you. Let's see.
Thank you, George. That was fascinating. We can take some time for questions coming up.
Yes, the next session isn't till 1. So
All
yes.
right. So if you have a question or comment or insults, you can put those into the chat or unmute yourself. And
I do,
Okay.
if you can hear me.
Yeah.
This is mostly for Sally, because one of the things that I've noticed about the characters in Lewis's books is his atheist characters are almost always bitter, angry, loners. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe Lewis was an atheist, right?
No.
So, or,
No.
Yeah.
No.
yeah,
No.
I've Googled this many times. But I don't know if he is, why were his atheist characters, they were all pretty much, even except for maybe Jim Lefferts, he was a little more filled out, but most of the characters, he just moved from one novel to another as the grumpy, cranky, rabble-rousing atheist character and just stuck him in the middle of. So do you have any insight on that?
Well, actually, I do. So because Lewis started out as a teenager anyway. He was very religious, especially when he went to Oberlin and he wanted to become a missionary. If you look at the quotes from his diary in Dave Simpkins' book, for example, I mean, it's all about his finding a religious calling. And at one point he tells his father that, I think I'd rather become a missionary than go to Yale. And his father says, forget it. When he goes to Yale, he gets Lewis. I find it so fascinating because although, you'd say, okay, well, he wants to be a missionary. He's very committed to a religious path, but he visits other churches. He visits synagogues. He visits a variety of religious organizations. And when he meets with, he becomes very familiar with Richard Irvine, who ran a church that was very much focused on social justice. And Lewis, I think, eventually realized that very set denominations and so forth really just did not capture Christianity. So I wouldn't call him an atheist. I call him an agnostic because he remained interested in religion his whole life. And I mean, even when he was traveling in Europe and so forth, he visited churches. It was organized religion that he was angry at. And I think that his atheists and his agnostics share his anger that the church kind of like kind of like Zenith and Gopher Prairie. It's not what it ought to be. It ought to be better than it is, and that fuels the anger. But as I said, I would call him an agnostic, somebody who would like to be convinced rather than forswearing God or something like that.
I want to jump in here. Can you hear me?
Sure.
Yeah. I think it's possible that he was also a believer in some way. Although his main problem was that he couldn't stand organized religion, as he couldn't stand organized just about anything. He doesn't like groups because they have an ideology, and the ideology is likely to be kind of cliched and stultifying. There's a character with a very small role in Elmer Gantry called Andrew Pengilly, who is who's a minister and is a true believer, and he's portrayed as the most positive character in the book. Search for Andrew Pengilly and you'll be impressed. I think Lewis had respect for people with faith, a lot of respect. He had respect for the Catholics, even in an age when the boundary between Catholics and Protestants was like an iron curtain. He bridged that gap very effectively.
Andrew Pettigilly, can I just do this?
Sure.
Andrew Pettigilly asks the most interesting question in Elmer Gantry. He says, "Why don't you believe in God?" And in a certain sense, that's just a protest against Elmer Gantry, but it's also a literal question. Why don't you? In other words, what would make you believe in God? And what the speeches or what the papers this morning have shown is that the possibility of the transcendent, which is a way of defining God, is absolutely absent in the world of Sinclair Lewis. In fact, I would argue, and I'm the second paper mentioned Dante, and because of course he's brought up at the comical dinner party in Babbitt, and all the circles called Venn diagrams in the paper. But what that is that's a representation of hell, of Dante's hell. It's circles, 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 and there's no way out of them because there's no way into the transcendent. There's only a way to go down deeper into them. And therefore, the question, why don't you, did I do that? Why don't you believe in God is a very relevant one. And what Lewis's novels offer is a view of America as hell. That's more extreme, perhaps, than has to be said, because there are other positive parts of it too. But Zenith is a kind of hell. You can't get out of it. You can't get out of any of the standardization. There's no escape. So there is no way to believe in God, particularly when what Dr. Drew really wants to hear is salacious stories about the Babbitt sinning with women, which leads me to the one question I have that somebody can answer later or now or never, whatever. I get why Paul Riesling is called Paul Riesling. Riesling is a kind of nice German wine. I get why Seneca Doan is called Seneca, because that's a Stoic philosopher in Rome or something of that sort. And I get the comedy of Virgil Gunch. That's one of my favorite names, Virgil and Dante, et cetera, et cetera. Why is Tannis Judique called? Is that just meant to be called Tannis Judique? Is that just meant to be a kind of, I don't know, offbeat, weird, quasi beatnik out of the realm name, or is there something about judiciousness that's going on in there? What's with Tannis? If anybody has thought of that or has a theory on that, I'd like to hear it. End of peroration.
Didn't Lingemann note that Tannis is an anagram for saint?
Oh, that's interesting. That's interesting. Yeah,
It's a mixed up saint.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I was actually, Sally and Sean Richard had been talking about this connection with Dante and with Virgil, and I think it's really interesting, the idea that it is a sort of hell, and I think there's lots of connections. I was actually thinking about that with my paper, and Virgil Gunch. If you know, Zenith is a hell, Virgil Gunch is a coal dealer, which is, I think, a sort of interesting kind of underworld connection. And the ultimate escape for Babbitt is Maine, which is overseen by Joe Paradise. So there's this sort of path from the underworld out to this paradise. It's interesting that he is rejected more or less by Joe Paradise. And with Robert McLaughlin's connections, thinking about his belonging and not belonging. It's interesting that when he gets to Maine, he envisions like this great welcome that he's going to have when he gets to Maine, and then he's like, it's kind of like stiff-armed when he gets there. I felt like by Joe Paradise. But anyways, I think that there seems to be a lot, in addition to obviously the seance, where they're calling on Dante, who, as George was saying, they have no capacity to understand, Dante. It doesn't sound anything like a Chum Frink poem or anything like that. So, yeah, but I think that there seem to be a number of things that Lewis might have had in mind.
But then at the end of the novel, does that make Myra into Beatrice?
I wonder if as a saint, because if there's an inferno and a paradise, is there also a purgatory? And is, thinking out loud, like, is the time with the bunch sort of a purgatory? Or is actually, his time in Chicago with what's his name, Doak, Sir Gerald Doak, feels very kind of purgatory-like. It's just,
I thought it was funny when he gets to paradise with Joe Paradise in Maine. What does he do but play cards and drink? I mean, he could have done that in Zenith. Or that's part of the hell. That's part of the inability to get out of it.
Actually, I'd like to relate this back to what George was talking about, because, for Babbitt, for all of the characters, language is kind of a prison, because they speak in certain grooves and they really can't get out of them. And I'm wondering if one could connect that to religious belief, because if you believe in a transcendent, it's ineffable. Language can't capture it.
Yeah.
And so, since these characters are characters of language, and a cliched language at that, perhaps that's part of their problem, is that they can't move beyond the language that they have that imprisons them into a real religious belief, as opposed to just sort of the rote sort of stuff that they say all the time.
Of course, that's Dante's problem in Paradiso, and half of Paradiso consists of saying why I can't tell you what I saw, because language is inadequate to the vision that is provided.
Mm-hmm.
I might follow up here with a note from about Aaron Gadd and the novel about the frontier and the missionaries on the frontier in Minnesota. Aaron Gadd, at the end of that novel, tells his wife, let's stop using words. He says, well, we can believe what we want to believe, but let's not use the words. As if words, words are just not right. And Aaron Gadd gives up being a missionary and becomes a builder in St. Paul. And he's happy giving up words. But that doesn't necessarily mean that his belief, his sense of the transcendent, is gone.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, it's kind of like he's decided to do something positive, just rather than talking about it.
Yeah.
Because the talking about it becomes a very circular sort of thing.
And it may be meaningless. Words just don't capture what is ineffable, as you say.
Mm-hmm.
Could some of the hostility to organized religion be connected with the fact that Protestant organized religion in the US in the 1920s was very much associated with prohibition, and he had a drinking problem?
That's interesting. I mean, a lot of Protestant churches in the 1920s moved to serving grape juice rather than wine, and in many Protestant religions today, including the Presbyterians, it's either grape juice, or some Presbyterian churches use both wine and grape juice. But that was very important back then.
Related to that, I was fascinated by the discussion of Dante as compared to some more contemporary discussions of religion with Protestantism and the prosperity gospel, muscular Christianity, capitalism, etc. Sally, I was wondering with that blend, if Sinclair Lewis had read or what the discourse was about Weber and the Protestant work ethic and the spirit of capitalism, or something, whether Veblen wrote about it or there were other texts that he was relying on in that context, is kind of mirroring of Dante and modern Protestants.
That's a really interesting question. I honestly don't know how much he read about Veblen, but I know he was aware of it. I mean, what struck me is that regardless of what he may or may not have read, that there was a certain kind of discourse that existed in the 20s that intertwined this masculinity and capitalism and religion as all being part of the same thing. There's the one of the articles that I referenced by Andrew Ball about Taylorism in religion, which came out just 2 or 3 years ago, I found fascinating, just because he was looking at how the discourse of religion and the discourse of business became so aligned that you really just you couldn't tease them apart.
I guess it reminds me of the subtle understandings of also different forms of Protestantism, whether in Minnesota or other reactions to that at the time.
Well, and I think the other thing too is that Lewis is very aware that religious belief really isn't that connected with the churches. It's more like indicating your socioeconomic class, so that if you're going to be a prosperous businessman, you're not going to be a Baptist. That's just the way it goes. You'll be Episcopalian, you'll be a Methodist, you'll be a Presbyterian, but some of the more evangelical religions, Catholicism, Judaism, just by being that kind of relegates you to a different part of society in the city.
One thing I just wanted to mention at the end with the conversation that was shown just reminded me how often today we criticize people who use text messaging.
Mm-hmm.
Why don't they just get on the phone and talk to each other? And yet when you see the conversation, I guess maybe the text messaging can be an improvement over, at least you get down to what you want to say and don't have all that verbiage that is meaningless.
I could make an over elaborate and suspicious point in the part that George quoted about Paulibus. When Babbitt is speaking to Paul, he calls him Paulibus. Well, in fact, that is Latin ablative plural for in the second declension for when you address somebody. So he's in effect using a scholarly correct, although Paul is only singular, but then what you could do, and I'm an English teacher, I was, so I could support anything. The idea is that Paul is many, and that Paul represents a kind of generic person to talk to, and that would then fit in with the interchangeability and language and everything else that you were talking about before. I don't believe that, though. I am struck by the moment in the smoking car when Paul sees the smokestacks of Pittsburgh or something, and he remarks how beautiful they are, and that shows the true artistic nature of Paul Riesling, and it's applied not to the usual cliched sort of things that Babbitt has in mind with the Maine woods and sunsets and all the crap that Fran Dodsworth comes up to believe, but instead it's applied to something uniquely American and industrial, which harks back to the opening description of the towers of Zenith. Lewis has an ambiguous attitude toward those, I think. He likes the pretty, the beautiful office buildings. They were frankly and beautifully their office buildings, and they have their own kind of beauty as well. But there's one step further, and you are in the world of Chum Frink's poem, where when he really likes the candy counters that are the same everywhere, because you can always be sure that when you buy your candy, you're going to get the same standard brand. So what's beautiful on the one hand is also hell on the other. That's why you can't get to heaven here.
Well, and that actually connects with one of the sort of the main point behind Lewis's work of art, which I think is a very underappreciated novel. But the question of what is this aesthetically beautiful? Does it have to be like a painting or a sculpture or something like that? Or could it be a well-run hotel? And that sounds very prosaic and kind of hellish, I suppose. But on the other hand, if you think about the brother who is the poet, well, he's an awful person. I mean, he seduces a young woman. He writes. His poetry is awful, and he's a very unkind person. On the other hand, the brother whose interests are more prosaic and making sure that the napkins are folded well, that the room is set up appropriately. I mean, he's the real artist. And so I think that Lewis is very conflicted about where art resides in this world.
Mr. Lewis, why don't you believe in art?
Oh, I think he does. I mean, I think when you think of some of the writing he has in Dodsworth about the art in Europe, which granted, I think it comes from a very Anglophile perspective from all his reading when he was growing up. I don't think he's anti-art. I think he tries to complicate what the nature of good art is.
Because he doesn't have a sure sense of what it is, which may be a good thing.
Connected to the novel and the comment about text messaging and formatting and art, George, your attention to the formatting was fascinating, in the connection to in reading Main Street versus Babbitt. One thing that always struck me is that Babbitt is so much more of a formatted book. There's all of these placements, that attention to detail, and that blend of whether it's a novel versus, I'm assuming that formatting was informed by all his work at the Saturday Evening Post or other links like that but it's a novel at the same time. So he's kind of blending these different forms of art and language, or use of language. So I was just curious what you thought some of his other inspirations might be for all of that placement.
Well, I thought you were going to go somewhere else with that. In the advertisement that's on 2 facing pages that George provided for us, well, it's full of boxes and full of everything is hemmed in, and it's fixed in the novel so that it covers 2 precise pages. Now, how they had to typeset that or not, I don't know. But if you want to say something you can't get out of, and it's all restricted and confined, and moreover, then the reader is co-opted into being the person who's looking at that ad as well. So he is then thrust into the hell that the advertisement unconsciously is mimicking.
Yeah, or advertisement as the most instrumentalized language use. Yeah,
I don't know sources, but we are, as I said at the end, we are surrounded by these genre of discourse, and he was surrounded in the 1920s by the same genre of discourse, and he simply wanted to reveal what they were. If you live a sort of normal middle class life, and you're not in an academic environment, these are the genre of discourse that surround you, that are your life every day. The society page, the feature article, the business letter, the advertisement, all these things are are the bread and butter of your verbal life. That's all you have, you know. You might have the Bible, you know, you might go to church, but in Lewis's case, the discourse at church, I mean, in Babbitt, the discourse at church wasn't any more illuminating or any more likely to connect you to something transcendent or fulfilling.
So
So
new historicism and I don't know, deconstructionism are themselves a kind of cliched discourse, which is another form of hell, even though they pretend to be the opposite.
Well, I mean, you know, as Bob was talking about the various groups, I mean, you know, the language that's used provides part of the membership in the group. So like if you own a Toyota, well, the Toyota owners or foreign car owners as opposed to American car owners, I mean, that's a kind of grouping that is kind of codified by the language of advertising, wouldn't you say?
Yes.
yeah.
Well, it's one of the, you know, in today's society, you know, people pay money to wear clothes with advertising other companies, you know, Nike or whatever on them. It's they want to show that some kind of group affiliation.
A Toyota is a palindrome, so that if you own a Toyota, you're going backwards and forwards at the same time and therefore going nowhere.
One thing that is in Lewis's experience, I'm trying to think of the sources for this formatting in Babbitt. One thing that was in his experience was he did work as a marketing person for publishers in New York during the teens. And so he knew a lot about advertising. He was a very good advertising guy himself. And so he understood the language of advertising and the language of marketing. And he always had, he kind of, you know, he wanted his books to be marketed well. One of the reasons he left Harcourt was because he didn't think that Harcourt was continuing to market his books that well. And he always liked this kind of thing. You know, it's sort of like his relationship to Babbitt. He likes Babbitt, even though he sees the horror of Babbitt. One of the things I've already told Sally that I want to tell everybody here is that I very much appreciate this conference because it caused me to go back and read Babbitt again. And I began to see strengths in Babbitt and artistic qualities in Babbitt that I had forgotten about or I hadn't seen before. I think Babbitt is really an extraordinary book. And I think it qualifies as a work of art. I think the fact that it's so complex, that it's not just a satire, but it's also strangely appreciative of its main character. I think that's a complexity that you just don't find very much. I think that's really a wonderful thing.
Well, you know, I agree because one of my, as Bob knows, one of my great hatreds in literature and film is the male midlife crisis novel, because it tends to be very self-indulgent and annoying, whereas Babbitt is one of those. And
Yeah.
I find it really remarkable that at the end, when he goes back to, you know, his family and the people, the roughnecks and all those people that have been made fun of and that he has forsworn, that we're kind of happy for him. I mean,
Yeah.
it's kind of melancholy, but at the same time, we're kind of happy. And I kept thinking,
Oh, yeah.
that's a really amazing accomplishment for him to make this turnaround, and for us not to feel bad or that he's sold out, but well, that he's come home in a way.
Yeah.
One
Good.
thing that I have always liked about Sinclair Lewis is that the endings of his novels, they end on usually some kind of a hopeful note, as opposed to John Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath, which just gets more and more depressing the more you read it. But the thing that I've noticed is that there are sort of two ways that things end. You have progress being made in a novel like King's Blood Royal, or even Aerosmith toward the end. But both Main Street and Babbitt circle back. And while, you know, the discussion has been, you know, extremely interesting, the characters end back where they started, as opposed to having truly made progress away, as some novels do, and apparently some novels don't.
Well, of course, I think part of that too is that at the end of Babbitt and the end of Main Street, and some of his other novels as well, that, well, things didn't quite work out as they hoped, and they didn't make as much progress, but they're looking to the next generation, and which might be hopeful, or, you know, it could be really depressing in the sense that, well, the next generation is not going to have much better luck than we did, but hopefully that'll happen.
Going to be car mechanics married to people who read romance magazines. That is progress.
Well, yeah, that's true.
One last comment of mine is that with the name Zenith, I have a nephew who lives in Acme, North Carolina. And every time I send him a card, I just think of Acme and Zenith as just very funny.
Well, we used to live in Normal, Illinois, and it's because the town had a normal school. But you know, when we first moved here from New York, we thought that was hilarious.
Yeah.
Well, I suppose it's almost 12:30 here, and we should probably take a break so people can get a bite to eat or something, and then we will resume at 1 o'clock.
1 o'clock, and the next Zoom link is in the chat.
Yes, Edsel, you put the next Zoom link in the chat, right?
Yes.
Okay. Excellent. Well, thank you everybody for coming and the great discussion and everything, and we'll see everybody in a half hour or so.